The wild, unforgiving waters rushed around Hannah Riley as she clung desperately to the branch of a submerged cottonwood tree, her knuckles white with effort, the roaring flood drowning out her screams for help. The spring of 1877 had brought the worst flooding the Nebraska Territory had seen in decades, transforming the peaceful plains into a raging inland sea that devoured everything in its path, including her family's homestead and possibly her future. Hannah had watched in horror as the waters rose with frightening speed, sweeping away the small farm her father had spent his last living years building. There had been no time to save anything but herself, and even that prospect now seemed doubtful as her strength ebbed away with each passing minute. The sodden dress that clung to her body felt like an anchor dragging her down, her waterlogged boots heavy as lead. "I can't hold on," she whispered, her voice breaking as another surge of water crashed against her. The branch creaked ominously beneath her grip, threatening to snap at any moment. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, and the icy water had long since numbed her lower body. When she had first fled her collapsing home, Hannah had thought the rising hill would provide safety. She never imagined the water would follow her there too, rising so quickly she'd barely had time to scramble into the branches of the old cottonwood. Now, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, she faced the terrifying reality that she might not survive to see it rise again. Miles away, Wyatt Irwin urged his horse through the flooded terrain, his experienced eyes scanning the devastation stretching across the plains. At 28, he had seen his share of natural disasters in his years working cattle drives across the Western Territories, but nothing quite like this. The ranch hands at the double circle where he worked as foreman had spent the past 2 days rescuing stranded families and livestock from the surging waters. "Easy, Thunder," he murmured to his dappled gray stallion as the animal carefully picked its way along a partially submerged ridge. Water lapped at the horse's fetlocks, but Thunder was sure-footed and trusted his rider implicitly. Wyatt had been riding this section of flooded plains since dawn, and exhaustion pulled at him like weights. But something instinct perhaps told him to push on just a little further before heading back to the ranch. The dying sunlight caught something in the distance, a flash of pale blue against the murky waters. Squinting against the glare, Wyatt made out what appeared to be a human form clinging to a tree nearly a quarter-mile away, surrounded by the rushing floodwaters. "Lord Almighty," he breathed, immediately spurring Thunder forward toward higher ground where they could circle around to approach the stranded figure. Hannah's fingers were slipping, her arms burning with the strain of holding herself above the churning waters. Her prayers had turned to quiet acceptance as darkness began to close in not just the approaching night, but the darkness of consciousness slipping away. The roaring in her ears had dulled to a distant hum when a sound cut through her fading awareness, hoofbeats and splashing water. "Hold on." A deep voice called out, startling her eyes open. "Just hold on, I'm coming." Through blurred vision, Hannah saw a figure on horseback navigating through the floodwaters toward her, the horse's powerful muscles working against the current. Hope flared within her chest, giving her the strength to tighten her grip on the branch once more. Wyatt guided Thunder as close to the tree as was safe, assessing the situation quickly. The woman, for he could now see it was indeed a young woman with long, honey-brown hair plastered to her pale face, looked near collapse, her arms visibly shaking as she clung to the branch. "Hold on," he called again, unbuckling his lariat from his saddle. "I'm going to throw you a rope." "Can you catch it?" Hannah managed a weak nod, though she wasn't certain she could do anything at all with her numb hands. Wyatt stood in his stirrups, swinging the lasso overhead before sending it sailing through the air. The first attempt fell short, the rope caught by the rushing current. Gritting his teeth, he reeled it in and tried again, this time aiming higher. The loop landed over a branch just above Hannah's head. "Grab onto it," Wyatt called, seeing her struggle to reach up. With the last of her strength, Hannah released one hand from her lifeline and grasped desperately for the rope. Her fingers brushed it once, twice, before finally closing around the rough hemp. She nearly sobbed with relief. That's it, now hold on tight. I'm going to pull you in, Wyatt instructed, slowly backing Thunder up to create tension on the rope. Hannah felt herself being dragged through the water, her body scraping against submerged branches and debris. The current fought against her, trying to tear her away from this lifeline, but she clung to the rope with a determination born of desperation. When she was close enough, Wyatt leaned down from his saddle, extending his hand. "Take my hand," he urged. "I've got you." Their fingers met, and in one powerful motion he hauled her up, helping her settle sideways across Thunder's withers in front of him. Hannah collapsed against him, shivering violently, too exhausted to speak. "Hold on," Wyatt said more softly this time, his arm securing her firmly against his chest as he turned his horse toward drier ground. "I've got you now, I won't let go." The words penetrated through Hannah's fog of exhaustion, and she found herself believing them completely, though this man was a stranger to her. His arm around her was solid and warm, the first warmth she had felt in hours, and she allowed herself to sink into the security it offered. As Wyatt guided Thunder carefully through the floodwaters toward higher ground, the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving them in the growing twilight. Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her and the strong heartbeat of the man behind her. "What's your name, miss?" Wyatt asked, trying to keep her awake and alert. "Hannah," she managed through chattering teeth. "Hannah Riley." "Miss Riley, I'm Wyatt Irwin, foreman at the Double Circle Ranch. We're heading there now. It's on high ground and dry. The owner's wife will help get you warm and dry." His deep voice rumbled against her back, oddly comforting. "My home," she whispered. "It's gone, everything's gone." Wyatt's arm tightened fractionally around her. "I'm sorry to hear that, but you're alive, and that's what matters right now." They rode in silence for nearly an hour, Wyatt occasionally checking that Hannah was still conscious, keeping up a steady stream of reassurances when he felt her trembling increase. Finally, the outline of buildings appeared on a distant rise, the ranch house and outbuildings of the Double Circle, lanterns glowing warmly in the windows. "Almost there," Wyatt told her. "Mrs. Thornton will take good care of you. She's mothered every ranch hand and stray soul that's come through for the past 20 years. As they approached the main house, doors flew open and figures emerged, drawn by the sound of Thunder's hooves on the packed earth of the yard. "Wyatt." "We were getting worried," called a stocky older man, hurrying toward them. His eyes widened when he saw Hannah. "Another survivor, found her clinging to a tree about 5 miles east," Wyatt explained, carefully dismounting while keeping one hand firmly on Hannah to prevent her from falling. "She's half frozen and exhausted. Her homestead's been washed away." A gray-haired woman pushed past the ranch owner, her expression shifting instantly from concern to determined efficiency. "Bring her inside, quickly. Thomas, fetch more firewood, and someone take care of that horse." Wyatt gathered Hannah into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. She was too weak to protest, her head lolling against his shoulder as he carried her into the warmth of the ranch house. The sudden heat made her skin prickle painfully after the hours of cold. "This way, Mrs. Thornton directed, leading them to a small bedroom off the main living area. "Put her there, I'll find some dry clothes." Wyatt gently laid Hannah on the bed, reluctant to release her, though he knew he must. Their eyes met briefly as he stepped back, and something unspoken passed between them, gratitude from her, a promise from him. Without a word, he turned and left the room, allowing Mrs. Thornton to take charge. The older woman worked efficiently, helping Hannah out of her sodden clothing and into a warm nightgown, all while talking in a soothing, motherly tone. "You poor dear, what an ordeal you've been through. Thank the Lord Wyatt found you when he did. That man has a sixth sense about these things, I swear. Now let's get you under these blankets." Too exhausted to speak, Hannah allowed herself to be tucked into the bed, the weight of several quilts piled on top of her a comforting pressure. Mrs. Thornton brought her hot broth, insisting she drink every drop before she could sleep. "Rest now," the woman said kindly, patting Hannah's hand. "You're safe here." As sleep claimed her, Hannah's last conscious thought was of the cowboy who had appeared like an apparition from the flood waters, his strong voice commanding her to hold on when she'd been ready to let go. Dawn broke clear and bright, the storm clouds that had unleashed such devastation having moved eastward. Hannah woke disoriented, momentarily panicked at finding herself in unfamiliar surroundings until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up slowly, her body aching in places she hadn't known could ache. A gentle knock at the door preceded Mrs. Thornton's entrance, the older woman carrying a tray with a steaming cup and a plate of food. "Good morning, dear." "It's good to see some color back in your cheeks," she said cheerfully, setting the tray on a small table beside the bed. "I've brought you some breakfast and a cup of coffee. Once you've eaten, I've laid out some clothes that should fit you well enough until we can sort something more permanent." "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton," Hannah said, her voice still hoarse. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." The older woman waved away her concerns. "Nonsense. In times like these, we all pull together. That's the way of things out here." She paused, studying Hannah with kind eyes. "Wyatt tells me you lost your home," Hannah nodded, fighting back sudden tears. "Everything. My father died last winter and I was trying to keep the homestead going on my own. Now there's nothing left." Mrs. Thornton's face softened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, dear. But you're welcome to stay here as long as you need." She patted Hannah's hand. "Eat your breakfast now, there'll be time enough to figure things out." After the older woman left, Hannah ate mechanically, the simple food tasting better than anything she could remember. True to her word, Mrs. Thornton had left a modest calico dress, slightly faded but clean, along with undergarments and a pair of boots that were only a little too large once dressed. Hannah ventured out of the bedroom, finding herself in a large, comfortable living area. Through the windows, she could see men moving about the ranch yard, attending to morning chores. Her eyes scanned the figures, instinctively searching for the tall form of the man who had saved her. "He's out checking on the floodwaters," came Mrs. Thornton's voice from behind her. The woman had an uncanny ability to read thoughts, it seemed. "Wyatt takes his responsibilities very seriously, but he asked after you this morning before he left." Hannah felt a flush creep into her cheeks. "He saved my life. I didn't even thank him properly." "You'll have your chance, Mrs. Thornton assured her. "Now, if you're feeling up to it, I could use some help with the washing. Keeping these ranch hands in clean clothes is a never-ending task." Grateful for the opportunity to be useful, Hannah spent the morning assisting Mrs. Thornton with household chores. The work kept her mind from dwelling on her losses and gave her a sense of purpose. By midday, she had learned that the Thornton Ranch was one of the largest in the area, with Mr. Thornton having settled there nearly 20 years earlier when the territory was still wild and largely unclaimed. "Wyatt's been with us for 5 years now," Mrs. Thornton explained as they prepared the midday meal for the ranch hands. "Best foreman we've ever had. The men respect him, and he's fair but firm. Thomas, that's Mr. Thornton, says he's never met anyone with better instincts for cattle or weather." Hannah listened, absorbing this information about her rescuer with more interest than she cared to admit. "Has he family nearby?" Mrs. Thornton shook her head. "No family that I know of. He's not one to talk much about his past, but I gather he's been on his own since he was quite young. Worked his way up from cowhand to foreman through sheer determination and skill." The sound of horses entering the yard drew their attention to the window. Several riders were dismounting, among them the tall figure Hannah recognized immediately. Wyatt removed his hat as he spoke to Mr. Thornton, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his nape. Even from a distance, Hannah could see the weariness in the set of his shoulders. "The men have been out since dawn, assessing the damage and helping neighbors," Mrs. Thornton explained. "They'll be hungry as wolves. Would you mind taking that pot of coffee out to the porch? I'll bring the stew." Hannah's heart quickened as she lifted the heavy coffee pot and made her way outside. The men were washing up at the pump in the yard, talking in low voices about what they'd seen. Wyatt stood slightly apart, splashing water on his face, the muscles in his forearms flexing as he dried himself with a rough towel. He turned as she approached, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. In the clear light of day, Hannah could see him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps only a few years older than her own 21 years. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his current serious expression indicated. "Miss Riley," he greeted her, his voice the same deep timbre she remembered from the flood. "It's good to see you up and about." "Thanks to you," Hannah replied, finding her voice. "I never properly thanked you for what you did yesterday. You saved my life, Mr. Irwin." A faint smile touched his lips. "Wyatt, please, and there's no thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same." "But it wasn't anyone, it was you," Hannah insisted quietly, "and I am grateful." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, perhaps before he nodded once in acknowledgement. "How are you feeling today?" "Sore, but alive," she answered honestly. "Mrs. Thornton has been very kind." "She has that way about her," Wyatt agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "Have you thought about what you'll do now?" The blunt question caught Hannah off guard, though she appreciated his directness. "Not beyond today," she admitted. "Everything I had was on that homestead." Wyatt's gaze turned thoughtful. "The waters will recede eventually. Some things might be salvageable." "Perhaps," Hannah said, though she held little hope. The last image she had of her home was of the roof disappearing beneath the raging waters. Mrs. Thornton's call for dinner interrupted their conversation, and Hannah was both relieved and disappointed. She had wanted to ask Wyatt more about himself, to understand the man who had appeared like an answer to her prayers in her darkest moment. As the ranch hands gathered around the long table, Hannah found herself seated beside Wyatt. Acutely aware of his presence, the clean scent of soap mingled with leather and horses. The careful way he made sure she was served first, the quiet authority he commanded among the men without ever raising his voice. The conversation around the table centered on the flood damage and recovery efforts. Several neighboring farms had been completely destroyed, and families were taking refuge wherever they could find shelter. "The Millers lost everything," one of the hands reported grimly. "Their youngest two would have drowned if Parker hadn't gotten there when he did." "The widow Johnson's place is underwater too," another added, "but she made it to her sister's in town before the worst hit." Hannah listened, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her tragedy was just one among many. When Mr. Thornton asked about her homestead, she described its location as best she could. "That's right in the path of the worst flooding," Wyatt said quietly. "I rode by that area this morning. The waters are starting to recede, but it's still too dangerous to get close." "I'd like to see it," Hannah said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "When it's safe, I mean. I need to know if anything can be salvaged." Wyatt studied her face for a moment before nodding. "I'll take you when the time is right. You have my word." His promise settled over her like a warm blanket, and Hannah realized with sudden clarity that she trusted this man completely, though she barely knew him. Perhaps it was because he had already proven his word when he'd promised not to let her go, holding her safely against him as they rode through the floodwaters. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as Hannah integrated herself into the life of the Double Circle Ranch. Mrs. Thornton was clearly delighted to have another woman about the place, and Hannah threw herself into helping with the endless tasks required to keep the ranch running smoothly. She learned that the Thorntons had lost their only daughter to fever many years ago, which perhaps explained the motherly affection Mrs. Thornton showed her from the start. Wyatt remained busy from dawn until dusk, often returning to the ranch house only after Hannah had retired for the night. But she found herself watching for him, and on the occasions when their paths crossed, they spoke briefly his quiet inquiries about her well-being, her questions about the recovery efforts happening throughout the region. 5 days after the flood, Wyatt found Hannah hanging laundry in the yard, her honey-brown hair gleaming in the sunlight, the sleeves of her borrowed dress rolled up to reveal slender forearms as she worked. "Miss Riley," he called, approaching with his hat in his hands. "I believe the waters have receded enough now. If you still wish to see your homestead, I could take you tomorrow morning." Hannah's hands stilled on the damp sheet she was hanging. "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, I'd like that very much, thank you." Wyatt nodded, his expression unreadable. Be ready at first light, it's still rough going in places. That night, Hannah slept fitfully, her dreams filled with rushing water and the phantom sensation of being carried in strong arms. She rose before dawn, dressing quickly in the practical riding skirt Mrs. Thornton had altered for her. Her stomach was too knotted with apprehension to eat more than a few bites of the breakfast the older woman insisted on preparing. Wyatt was waiting in the yard, holding the reins of 2 horses, his gray stallion Thunder and a gentle-looking chestnut mare. He wore a simple flannel shirt, worn denim pants, and his customary hat pulled low over his eyes. The pistol at his hip and the rifle in his saddle holster were the only indications that danger might still lurk in the flood-ravaged countryside. "This is Penny," he said, nodding toward the mare as Hannah approached. "She's steady and sure-footed. She'll carry you safely." Hannah stroked the horse's velvety nose, grateful for the distraction from her nervousness about what lay ahead. "She's beautiful." "Can you mount on your own, or would you like assistance?" Wyatt asked, his tone practical rather than condescending. "I can manage," Hannah assured him, placing her foot in the stirrup and swinging herself up with a practiced motion that clearly surprised him. At his raised eyebrow, she added, "My father believed girls should know how to ride as well as boys." A hint of a smile touched Wyatt's lips. "A wise man, your father." He mounted Thunder in one fluid motion and nudged the stallion forward. "Stay close, the ground is still treacherous in places." They rode in companionable silence as the sun rose higher, bathing the landscape in golden light that belied the destruction visible all around them. Debris hung from tree branches well above their heads, marking how high the floodwaters had reached. The normally lush prairie grass was flattened and coated with mud, and occasionally they passed the bloated carcass of livestock that hadn't escaped the deluge. "It's hard to believe this happened so quickly," Hannah remarked as they picked their way along what had once been a well-traveled road but was now barely discernible. "One day everything was normal and the next. Nature doesn't give much warning out here," Wyatt replied. "And she doesn't play favorites. I've seen men build their whole lives only to have it all swept away in minutes by flood, fire, or tornado." "That's a bleak outlook," Hannah observed, studying his profile. Wyatt shrugged. "Just the truth as I've seen it. But I've also seen those same men rebuild, often stronger than before." They crested a small rise, and Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Below them stretched what had once been her family's homestead, the 10 acres her father had cultivated so carefully, the small but sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands. Now, there was little left to indicate anyone had ever lived there at all. The cabin was completely gone, with only the stone chimney still standing like a lone sentinel. The fields were buried under a thick layer of silt and debris, and the few trees that remained were stripped of their lower branches. Hannah felt a sob rising in her chest but swallowed it back, determined not to break down. Wyatt said nothing, giving her time to absorb the full impact of her loss. "Would you like to go closer?" he asked finally, his voice gentler than she had yet heard it. Hannah nodded mutely, and they guided their horses down the slope. As they approached the site where her home had stood, the devastation became even more apparent. Pieces of her former life lay scattered and broken, a chair leg protruding from the mud, the metal frame of her father's bed twisted around what remained of a fence post, fragments of dishes and cookware half buried in silt. Dismounting, Hannah moved among the ruins in a daze, occasionally bending to touch some recognizable item, her mother's broken china teacup, the handle of her father's favorite axe, a sodden book whose pages had fused together into an unreadable mass. Wyatt remained a respectful distance behind her, watching silently as she confronted the reality of her situation. When she finally turned to him, her face was composed, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "There's nothing left to salvage," she said simply. "I'm sorry," Wyatt replied, and the genuine regret in his voice nearly undid her careful composure. Hannah took a deep breath, looking around one last time at what had been her home. "At least now I know I can stop wondering." As she moved to return to her horse, her foot caught on something buried in the mud. Kneeling, she carefully extracted a small metal box, her father's strongbox, which he had kept beneath his bed. The lock had held despite the flood, and when she opened it with the key she still wore on a cord around her neck, she found its contents remarkably intact: her parents' marriage certificate, the deed to the homestead, and a small leather pouch containing a few gold coins her father had saved over the years. "Not everything is lost after all," Wyatt observed quietly. Hannah clutched the box to her chest, overwhelmed by this small mercy. "No, not everything." They remounted their horses and turned away from the devastated homestead. As they rode, Hannah found herself talking about her life there, her father's dreams for the farm, her mother's early death from influenza, the quiet evenings spent reading by lamplight while her father whittled or repaired harnesses. Wyatt listened without interruption, offering only occasional questions that showed he was genuinely interested in her story. It wasn't until they stopped to rest the horses by a small creek that he shared anything of his own past. "I was orphaned young," he said without preamble as they sat on fallen logs, watching the horses drink. "My father was killed in a mining accident when I was 10, and my mother couldn't manage on her own with 4 children. She placed me with a cattle driver who needed an extra hand, thinking it would be temporary. But it wasn't," Hannah guessed, watching his face. Wyatt shook his head. "No, she died of consumption before the year was out. My sisters were taken in by an aunt back east, but there was no room or resources for me, so I stayed with the outfit, learning the cattle business from the ground up." "That must have been difficult for a child," Hannah said softly. "It was hard," he admitted, "but it taught me self-reliance. And eventually, I found people like the Thorntons who became a kind of family." In that moment, sharing the quiet aftermath of loss, something shifted between them, a recognition of kindred spirits who understood what it meant to rebuild from nothing. As they mounted up to return to the double circle, Wyatt asked the question Hannah had been avoiding since the flood. "What will you do now, Miss Riley?" Hannah considered for a moment before answering. "I don't know yet. The land is still mine according to the deed, but I have no means to rebuild on my own. Perhaps I could sell it and use the money to start fresh somewhere." "There's no rush to decide," Wyatt assured her. "The Thorntons are happy to have you stay as long as needed." "I can't impose indefinitely," Hannah protested. "I need to find work to be self-sufficient." Wyatt studied her thoughtfully. "Mrs. Thornton mentioned the other day that she's been wanting help with the household accounts and correspondence. She finds it increasingly difficult with her arthritis." "It's not much, but it would be a position with room and board." Hannah's pride warred briefly with practicality before the latter won out. "I would be grateful for the opportunity," she said finally. "I can read and write well, and my father taught me basic accounting for the farm." Wyatt nodded, satisfied. "I'll speak to the Thorntons tonight." True to his word, Wyatt arranged the position, and Hannah soon found herself with official duties at the ranch. Mrs. Thornton was delighted to hand over the account books and letter writing, tasks that had become increasingly painful for her gnarled hands. Mr. Thornton, initially skeptical of having a young woman involved in ranch business, was quickly won over by Hannah's efficient organization and clear handwriting. Spring advanced into early summer, the land slowly recovering from the flood's devastation. Hannah's days took on a pleasant routine: mornings spent on accounts and correspondence, afternoons helping Mrs. Thornton with household tasks, evenings often spent on the porch as the ranch hands gathered to smoke and talk after the day's work. She found herself watching for Wyatt during these times, noting the quiet authority with which he managed the men and the ranch operations. Unlike some of the other hands who boasted loudly of their exploits or told tall tales, Wyatt spoke only when he had something worth saying, and the others invariably fell silent to listen when he did. As Hannah became more comfortable at the double circle, she began venturing beyond household duties, occasionally helping with the chickens or the kitchen garden Mrs. Thornton maintained. It was while gathering eggs one morning that she encountered Wyatt unexpectedly in the barn, where he was treating a cut on Thunder's leg. "Good morning, Miss Riley," he greeted her, his hands continuing their careful work as he applied salve to the wound. "Please, after all this time, couldn't you call me Hannah?" she asked impulsively, setting down her basket of eggs. Wyatt glanced up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he nodded. "Hannah, then, and I suppose you should call me Wyatt if we're to be on equal footing." "Is Thunder badly hurt?" she asked, moving closer to observe the stallion's injury. "Just a cut from barbed wire. He'll heal quickly enough if infection doesn't set in." Wyatt straightened, patting the horse's neck reassuringly. "You seem to be settling in well here." "I am," Hannah admitted. "Everyone has been so kind, but—" She hesitated, uncertain whether to voice the thoughts that had been troubling her lately. "But," Wyatt prompted, his blue eyes intent on her face, "but I can't help feeling I should be doing more to secure my own future," she finished. "The position with Mrs. Thornton is wonderful, but it's dependent on her goodwill. If something were to happen, I'd be adrift again." Wyatt considered her words thoughtfully. "That's sensible planning. Have you given thought to what you'd like to do?" Hannah moved to lean against the stall door, absently stroking Thunder's velvety nose. "I've been thinking about my land. It's good soil once it dries completely. My father chose it carefully, but I couldn't farm it alone, and hiring help requires money I don't have." "You could sell it," Wyatt suggested, though something in his tone suggested he didn't consider this the best option. "I could," Hannah agreed, "but it feels like giving up on my father's dream, and land is becoming scarcer every year as more settlers arrive." Wyatt nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "There might be another option. The Parkers lost their farm in the flood and have decided to move back east to family. They're looking to sell their remaining livestock, a small herd of dairy cows that survived by being on high ground during the flood." Hannah's interest was immediately piqued. "Dairy cows, 5 head, good producers from what I hear. Not enough for a large operation, but enough to start. Milk, butter, and cheese sell well in town, especially with the new railroad camp nearby." The idea took root in Hannah's mind instantly. She had grown up helping her father with their 2 milk cows and knew the work involved. It was demanding but not beyond her capabilities, especially if she started small. "How much are they asking?" she asked, mentally calculating the gold coins in her father's strongbox. "More than you likely have," Wyatt said frankly, "but there might be a solution to that too." Hannah raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I've been saving to buy my own place someday," Wyatt explained. "I could invest in the herd as a partner. We could build a small cabin and dairy on your land, run the operation together until you can buy me out or we expand enough for a full partnership." The proposal was so unexpected that Hannah could only stare at him for a moment. "You would do that? Invest your savings in a partnership with me?" Wyatt met her gaze steadily. "It makes good business sense. You have land but need capital. I have some capital but no land. Together, we could build something worthwhile." Hannah's mind raced with possibilities. It was a practical arrangement that could benefit them both financially. But there was something else in Wyatt's expression that suggested his motivations might not be entirely business-related, or perhaps that was merely wishful thinking on her part. She chided herself. "I would need to think about it," she said finally. "It's a significant decision for both of us." "Of course," Wyatt agreed easily. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands." That night, Hannah lay awake long after the household had fallen silent, weighing Wyatt's proposal from every angle. A business partnership was a serious commitment, one that would tie their futures together in significant ways. Was she ready for that? And what of the confusing feelings she had developed for the taciturn foreman, feelings that went well beyond gratitude for her rescue or admiration for his capabilities? When dawn broke, she had made her decision. She found Wyatt at the corral, watching as one of the younger hands worked with a partially broken colt. "I'd like to accept your offer," she said without preamble, "but I want everything clearly agreed upon and written down, a proper business arrangement." Wyatt's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll draw up an agreement and have Mr. Thornton witness it." True to his methodical nature, Wyatt arranged everything efficiently. Within a week, they had purchased the Parkers' cows, drawn up a detailed partnership agreement, and begun preparations for building a simple cabin and dairy operation on Hannah's land. Mr. Thornton, initially concerned about losing his foreman, was reassured when Wyatt explained he would continue his duties at the Double Circle while getting the new venture established. "It will take time to build and get the operation running smoothly," Wyatt had explained. "I won't leave you short-handed." Hannah, meanwhile, set about learning everything she could about commercial dairy operations, poring over agricultural journals Mr. Thornton ordered for her and asking endless questions of Mrs. Thornton, who had run a small dairy in her younger years. The first trip back to her land with building materials rather than for mourning was a turning point for Hannah. As she watched Wyatt and 2 ranch hands he had hired to help begin clearing the site for the cabin, she felt a surge of hope replace the despair that had gripped her since the flood. "We'll build it higher on the rise," Wyatt explained as they walked the property. "Even if flooding comes again, it won't reach this point." The cabin they planned was modest, just 2 rooms to start, with the possibility of expansion later. The dairy would be separate, a small but well-designed building with proper cooling systems for the milk and cream and space for cheese-making equipment. "It's not much," Wyatt said almost apologetically as he showed Hannah the simple plans he had drawn, "but it's a beginning." "It's perfect," Hannah assured him, genuinely pleased with the practical design. "We can always expand later once we're established and profitable." Construction began in earnest, with Wyatt spending every spare moment at the site when his duties at the Double Circle permitted. Hannah joined him whenever possible, helping where she could and learning about construction techniques as they worked. It was during these shared hours of labor that they truly began to know each other beyond the surface. Conversation flowed more easily when hands were busy with work, and Hannah discovered layers to Wyatt's character that his typically reserved demeanor concealed his dry sense of humor. His extensive knowledge of literature, gained from years of reading by campfire light. His thoughtful observations about human nature learned from a lifetime of watching people at their best and worst. In turn, Wyatt came to appreciate Hannah's resilience and practical intelligence, her willingness to tackle any task without complaint, and the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive not only the flood but the loss of her parents and everything familiar. One evening, as they sat on a stack of lumber sharing a simple meal Mrs. Thornton had packed for them, Hannah asked the question that had been on her mind since their partnership began. "Why did you really suggest this arrangement, Wyatt? There must be safer investments for your savings than a dairy operation with a woman you barely know." Wyatt took his time answering, his gaze focused on the distant horizon where the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "When I pulled you from that flood," he said finally, "something changed for me. I've saved people before, it's part of life out here, but with you—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "With you, I couldn't just ride away knowing you were safe. I needed to see you rebuild, to thrive. And then I got to know you, and I realized we could build something together that might be better than what either of us could manage alone." The simple honesty of his answer touched Hannah deeply. "I'm glad you didn't just ride away," she said softly. "And not only because I'd be destitute otherwise." Their eyes met in the fading light, and for a moment, Hannah thought Wyatt might reach for her hand where it rested between them on the lumber. But the moment was broken by the arrival of one of the ranch hands with more building materials, and the opportunity for further conversation was lost. As summer progressed, the cabin took shape, a sturdy structure of logs and planking that, while simple, promised to be warm in winter and cool in summer. The dairy building followed, with special attention paid to proper ventilation and cooling systems critical for quality milk production. Throughout the building process, Hannah continued her duties at the Double Circle, setting aside as much of her small salary as possible for additional equipment they would need. Mrs. Thornton, who had become almost a mother figure to her, provided practical advice on everything from household management to the intricacies of butter making for commercial sale. "You'll need proper churns if you're to produce in quantity," the older woman advised. "And reliable help for the heavy work." One person can't manage 5 cows alone, especially if you're to do the processing as well. This reality led to another conversation with Wyatt about the practicalities of their arrangement. Up to this point, they had operated on the assumption that Hannah would live alone in the cabin, with Wyatt continuing at the double circle and visiting the dairy operation regularly to handle the heavier work. It's not practical, Wyatt concluded after they had discussed the logistics. The dairy needs daily attention, and riding back and forth from the double circle will waste valuable time. I'll need to live on site as well. Hannah felt her cheeks warm at the implication. That would hardly be proper. People would talk. Wyatt's expression remained serious. They'll talk regardless, but we can address the proprieties by adding a small bunkhouse for me alongside the cabin. Separate dwellings, but close enough that I'm available for the work. It was a sensible solution, and yet Hannah felt a twinge of disappointment that surprised her. She had grown accustomed to Wyatt's company during their working hours and found herself looking forward to their conversations more than she cared to admit. Very well, she agreed. A bunkhouse makes sense. Construction of the additional small structure began immediately, though Wyatt insisted it was secondary to completing the main cabin and dairy. You need proper shelter before the weather turns, he explained. I can make do with temporary arrangements if necessary. By late summer, the cabin was complete enough for habitation, though still lacking some finishing touches. The dairy building was fully functional, with 5 stalls for the cows, a milking area, and a separate room for processing, complete with a cooling system that used water from the nearby creek. The day Hannah moved from the double circle to her new home was bittersweet. Mrs. Thornton hugged her fiercely, pressing a basket of household necessities into her hands. You'll visit often, the older woman insisted, and remember, you're always welcome back if you need anything at all. Mr. Thornton was more reserved in his farewell, but made it clear that both Hannah and Wyatt remained part of the extended double circle family. You've got good sense between you, he told them gruffly, and I expect to hear you're turning a profit within the year. Hannah's first night alone in the new cabin was strangely unsettling. The building was solid and secure, but after months of living in the busy ranch house, the silence seemed oppressive. Through the single window, she could see the light from Wyatt's lantern in the partially completed bunkhouse where he had insisted on staying despite her offers to wait until it was properly finished. The cows would arrive the next day, marking the true beginning of their dairy venture. Hannah lay awake for hours, her mind filled with a mixture of excitement, anxiety, and another emotion she was reluctant to name, a longing for Wyatt's presence that went beyond practical considerations of safety or work requirements. Dawn broke clear and bright, and with it came the organized chaos of establishing the dairy operation. The cows arrived first, placid animals that seemed unperturbed by their new surroundings. Wyatt handled them with quiet confidence, showing Hannah the particulars of each animal's temperament. This one's Daisy, he said, patting a brown and white spotted cow. She gives the richest milk but can be stubborn about coming in from pasture. And this is Buttercup, gentlest disposition of the lot, but watch your feet because she'll step on them without a thought. Hannah absorbed the information, already planning the daily routine that would structure their lives in the coming months. The milk would need to be processed quickly after each milking, with butter churned every second day and cheese set to age on a regular schedule. We should be able to make our first delivery to town by the end of the week, Wyatt calculated as they worked side by side in the dairy. I spoke with the general store owner, and he's agreed to take whatever butter and fresh milk we can supply. The railroad camp will take cheese as well. The work was exhausting but satisfying. Hannah found herself falling into bed each night too tired to think, yet with a sense of accomplishment that had been missing since the flood. Wyatt proved to be an ideal partner, reliable, hardworking, and remarkably knowledgeable about aspects of dairy farming she wouldn't have expected from a cattleman. My first job was with a family that kept dairy cows alongside their beef cattle, he explained when she commented on his expertise. The wife taught me milking before I was tall enough to reach a horse's stirrup properly. Their days quickly fell into a rhythm: early morning milking, followed by processing, afternoon maintenance and care of the animals, evening milking and preparation for the next day. Twice weekly, Wyatt would load the wagon with their products and make the journey to town, returning with supplies and news. It was during one such return that he brought information that would dramatically alter their fledgling business. "The railroad camp has doubled in size," he reported as they unloaded supplies. "They've brought in more workers for the final push to complete the line. The foreman says they're desperate for regular milk and butter supplies more than we can currently provide." Hannah's mind immediately began calculating possibilities. "We could add more cows," she mused, "but we'd need help with the additional work." "I've been thinking about that," Wyatt said, placing a sack of sugar on the cabin's small shelf. "The Johnsons' eldest boy is looking for work. 16, responsible, and already experienced with dairy animals. We could hire him for the morning and evening milking, freeing us for the processing and business side." The casual way Wyatt said "we" and "us" warmed Hannah in ways she found increasingly difficult to ignore. Over the weeks of working together, their partnership had evolved into something that felt remarkably like a marriage in all but name: shared meals, shared work, shared plans for the future. Yet Wyatt had made no move to suggest their relationship might become more personal, maintaining a respectful distance that sometimes frustrated Hannah more than she cared to admit. "Hiring help makes sense," she agreed. "And expanding to meet the railroad camp's needs could put us on solid financial footing much sooner than we anticipated." "My thoughts exactly," Wyatt said with satisfaction. "I'll speak to young Johnson tomorrow." With the addition of Robert Johnson to their workforce and the purchase of 3 more cows, the dairy operation expanded rapidly. By early autumn, they were producing enough to supply not only the general store and railroad camp, but also 2 boarding houses in town that catered to travelers and temporary workers. The increased income allowed them to make improvements to both buildings' glass windows for the cabin, a proper stove instead of the simple fireplace they had been using, additional shelving in the dairy for aging cheese. Wyatt completed his bunkhouse with proper furnishings, though Hannah noticed he spent less time there than at the main cabin, often staying late into the evening discussing business or simply talking by the fire. As the weather cooled, bringing the first hints of winter to the plains, Hannah found herself increasingly aware of Wyatt's presence: the way his hands moved confidently as he worked with the animals, the deep timbre of his voice as he instructed young Robert, the rare but transformative smile that occasionally brightened his serious face. One evening, as they sat by the fire going over the account books, Hannah glanced up to find Wyatt watching her with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "What is it?" she asked, self-consciously tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I was just thinking about the day I found you in the flood," Wyatt said quietly. "How close I came to not riding out that far, how different things might have been." Hannah set down her pencil, meeting his gaze. "I've thought of that too, if you hadn't come when you did." "But I did," Wyatt interrupted gently. "And now look at what we've built together." "Yes," Hannah agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at what we've built." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression, a decision made, perhaps. He closed the account book and moved to sit beside her on the small bench. "Hannah," he began, his voice unusually hesitant, "when I suggested this partnership, I had practical reasons. Good business sense, as I said, but there was more to it than that, even then." Hannah's breath caught in her throat as Wyatt took her hand in his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I find myself thinking of you not just as a business partner, but as someone I want to build a life with," he continued. "Not just a dairy operation, but a home. A family, perhaps someday." "Wyatt," Hannah breathed, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I'm not a man of flowery words," he said, a hint of self-deprecation in his tone, "but I've come to care for you deeply, more than I thought possible. And I'd like to make our partnership more permanent if you feel the same." It wasn't the most romantic of proposals, but to Hannah, it was perfect in its honest simplicity. "I do feel the same," she answered, squeezing his hand. "I have for some time." The smile that transformed Wyatt's face then was unlike any she had seen before, unreserved and radiant with joy. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward until his lips met hers in a gentle kiss that promised everything they had been silently hoping for. When they parted, Wyatt kept her hand in his. "We could be married before winter sets in," he suggested practically. "The circuit preacher comes through town next month." Hannah laughed softly at his methodical approach, even to this. "Always planning ahead, aren't you?" "I've found it serves me well," Wyatt replied with a hint of a smile, "especially when planning for things that matter most." The month that followed was filled with preparations not just for the wedding, but for the winter ahead and the continued expansion of their business. Word of their engagement spread quickly, with Mrs. Thornton arriving the very next day, full of excitement and practical advice. "I knew from the moment he brought you to the ranch that there was something special between you two," she declared, helping Hannah sort through the fabric she had ordered for new curtains and a wedding dress. "The way he looked at you when he thought no one was watching, like you were water in the desert." Hannah blushed at the description, but couldn't deny the happiness that filled her each time she caught Wyatt's gaze across the room, or the way his hand would find hers whenever they were near, as though reassuring himself of her presence. The wedding took place on a crisp November day, with the ceremony held in the town's small church. The Thorntons stood as witnesses, along with several of the double-circle hands who had helped build their new home. Hannah wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Thornton had helped her sew, with a crown of late autumn flowers in her hair. Wyatt, looking uncharacteristically nervous, wore his best shirt and a new vest Mr. Thornton had insisted on giving him as a wedding gift. The preacher's words were traditional and brief, but when Wyatt repeated his vows, his voice clear and unwavering, Hannah felt as though they were the only two people in the world. The gold band he placed on her finger had belonged to his mother, the one memento he had kept through all his years of wandering. "I've been carrying it since I was 10 years old," he told her later as they rode back to their home, now truly theirs together. Waiting for the right person to give it to. The transition from business partners to husband and wife was surprisingly seamless, perhaps because in many ways they had already been living as a married couple in all but name. The bunkhouse was repurposed as a storage building, its furnishings moved into the cabin that now held the warmth of shared love as well as shared work. Winter settled over the plains, bringing snow and cold winds that howled around the sturdy cabin walls. Inside, Hannah and Wyatt created a haven of warmth and contentment. The dairy operation continued to thrive despite the challenges of winter, with Robert Johnson proving himself invaluable in maintaining routines during the worst of the weather. As they lay together in the quiet darkness of winter nights, Hannah often thought of how far she had come from that terrifying day in the flood. From clinging desperately to a tree branch, certain she would die alone, to building a new life filled with purpose and love. "What are you thinking about?" Wyatt asked one such night, his arm drawing her closer against the chill that seeped through even the best insulated walls. "About the flood," Hannah answered honestly, "and how something so terrible could lead to something so wonderful." Wyatt's hand gently stroked her hair. "Life has a way of balancing itself, I think. Great loss often precedes great gain, though it's hard to see when you're in the midst of the storm." "You're becoming quite philosophical in your old age," Hannah teased, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Must be your influence," he replied, the smile evident in his voice even in the darkness. "You've changed me in ways I never expected." Hannah Irwin. The name still sounded new and wonderful to her ears. Hannah Irwin no longer alone in the world, no longer struggling to hold on. Spring returned to the plains, bringing with it new growth and possibilities. The dairy operation expanded again with the addition of a proper cheese house, allowing them to increase production of the aged cheeses that had become their most profitable product. Robert Johnson's younger sister joined the workforce, proving to have a natural talent for buttermaking that surpassed even Hannah's skill. With the business thriving, Hannah and Wyatt began to think beyond mere survival toward building something that would last for generations. They added a proper living room to the cabin, with shelves for the books Wyatt had begun collecting and comfortable chairs for evening reading. The garden expanded to include not just vegetables but flowers that brightened the yard with splashes of color. On the anniversary of the flood, they rode together to the spot where Wyatt had found Hannah clinging to the submerged tree. The land had healed in the year since the disaster, with new growth covering much of the scarring left by the raging waters. Only the occasional piece of debris caught in the highest branches of surviving trees gave evidence of how high the waters had risen. "It's hard to believe it happened here," Hannah said, looking around at the peaceful scene. "It seems like another lifetime." "In many ways it was," Wyatt replied, his hand finding hers as they sat on horseback, surveying the transformed landscape. "For both of us." They rode back to their home in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts of how far they had come and the future stretching before them. As they approached the rise where their cabin and dairy building stood, Hannah felt a surge of pride and contentment. What they had built together was more than just a successful business, it was a true partnership of hearts and minds, a shared vision made real through hard work and love. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the plains in gold and crimson, Hannah had news to share that would add yet another dimension to their happiness. "I went to see Dr. Miller in town today," she said, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "We'll be needing to add another room to the cabin by winter." Wyatt's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension, and then to a joy so profound it transformed his entire being. "A baby?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Hannah nodded, her own eyes bright with happy tears. "Our family is growing just as our business has." Wyatt pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that spoke volumes. "When I told you to hold on that day in the flood, I never imagined what we would be holding on to together," he said, his lips brushing her temple. "A home, a business, a future, and now a child. I'm glad I held on," Hannah whispered against his chest, "and that you never let go." As twilight deepened around them, bringing the first stars of evening to the vast prairie sky, they remained on the porch, planning and dreaming as they had done since the beginning of their partnership. But now their dreams included a child's laughter, tiny footsteps on the cabin floor, and the continuation of what they had built together passed down to a new generation. From near tragedy had come the greatest blessing of Hannah's life, not just survival, but a love that had grown from the unlikeliest of beginnings. A cowboy's outstretched hand in flood waters, a promise to hold on, and a future neither of them could have imagined on that desperate day when all seemed lost. The dairy farm on the plains would flourish for many years to come, expanding into one of the most successful operations in the county. Hannah and Wyatt would welcome 3 children over the years, 2 sons, and a daughter who grew up learning the value of hard work, partnership, and resilience from parents who embodied these qualities daily. And though they rarely spoke of the flood to others, each spring when the rains came, they would share a look of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of how their story began with a woman drowning in flooded plains and a cowboy who said, "Hold on and never let go."